Chapter 1. The Morning of Humiliation. My name is Karen Lawson, and I am 34 years old. For years, I watched my parents open their doors with kindness, believing family meant trust. But the morning my sister-in-law knocked the vase from my mother's hands and sent her collapsing to the floor, I felt something inside me break. In that single moment, I saw 8 years of sacrifice, silence, and quiet humiliation turn into a storm of betrayal. I knew then that if I stayed silent one more day, we would lose not just our home, but the dignity that held us together as a family. The morning began with the kind of softness I used to think would last forever. A thin winter sun spilled across the maple table in my parents' kitchen, catching on the rim of the blue ceramic vase my mother loved. Linda moved lightly between the sink and the counter, humming the half-tune she always hummed when she arranged flowers. I could smell coffee and oranges and the clean starch of the dish towels she kept folded in a neat stack by the stove. My father sat at the end of the table with the Columbus Dispatch open in front of him. He lifted his glasses now and then and made a small, thoughtful sound, the same sound he had made my entire life when he reached the editorial page. The house felt old and sturdy around us, the sort of Ohio house that had held its ground through blizzards and graduations and quiet nights after long days. From the living room came the restless cry of the baby. Emily had been up most of the night and she wanted the whole house to know it. I heard the soft rustle of the blanket she kept wrapped around her shoulders, the click of the bottle warmer, the tired way she set things down just loudly enough to say that everyone else should be quieter. David had taken the early morning shift with the stroller and the dog, so for this hour there were 4 of us awake and measuring one another like pieces in a careful balance. Mom glanced at me and smiled. It was a small smile, the kind a person wears after months of learning where her edges must be. I told her I would put the vase on the coffee table, and she nodded, grateful for help, grateful for company. She placed the flowers into my hands, and I felt the cool stems through the glass, the faint prick of a thorn she had missed. She wiped her palms on her apron and said that the croissants were almost ready. Dad looked up and asked if there was more coffee. I poured and set the cup by his hand, and he thanked me without looking away from the paper. The baby cried again. It was that thin newborn cry that goes right through your chest and settles somewhere behind your ribs. Emily called from the living room that the bottle was not warm enough and that the noise in the kitchen was too much. She said the baby needed calm. She said the baby was finally sleeping and that every sound would undo it. Mom glanced at the clock even though she did not need to. She moved toward the living room with the vase between her hands, the way a person carries something fragile when the more fragile thing is actually herself. I followed her down the short hall. The living room was flooded with flat winter light. Emily sat on the edge of the sofa with the baby tucked in the crook of her elbow. She was 32 and beautiful in that severe way that looks like discipline. The room had been rearranged again. The armchair my mother loved had been turned away from the window and angled toward the television, and the quilt from the guest bedroom was draped over the back of the couch as if this had always been its place. Mom stopped a few feet from Emily and set the vase on the coffee table. She said she thought flowers would be nice for the baby, something bright to look at, something cheerful for the room. Emily looked at the vase and then at my mother. Her mouth curled as if the smell of roses offended her. She said the baby did not need pollen right now. She said the water would spill and the petals would fall and that it was unhygienic. She said my mother should take the vase back to the kitchen. Mom reached for the vase again. Her hand shook a little because her hands sometimes did that these days, not from sickness, but from a year of being corrected. She hooked her fingers around the rim and straightened. As she turned, Emily rose quickly with the baby. She moved into my mother's path and lifted her free hand in a sharp motion. Her palm struck the vase hard enough to jar it from my mother's grip. Water splashed across the table and down my mother's front. For half a second, the vase spun along the edge like a coin. My mother tried to catch it. Her heel slipped. Her knees hit the floor with a sound that made my throat close. I did not think. I dropped to my knees beside her. She was breathing fast and blinking, trying to understand whether her body hurt or whether only her pride did. Water had already begun to darken the fibers of the rug. Red petals clung to her sweater like small wounds. I pressed my hand under her elbow and told her I had her. She nodded once, but her eyes were on Emily. Emily stood above us with the baby held high against her shoulder. She said that my mother should never reach toward the baby with wet hands. She said that my mother should remember her age and act accordingly. She said that this was not a safe environment for a newborn, and that boundaries would have to be respected if we wanted the baby to thrive. Her voice was measured and bright, a warning disguised as common sense. My father appeared in the doorway and took in the scene as if it were a puzzle. He said that everyone should take a breath. He said that accidents happen. He said that we should not escalate. He crouched clumsily toward my mother and touched her shoulder. She pressed her lips together and shook her head once, not in refusal but in humiliation. I got her to her feet. The knees of her jeans were wet and dark. She stood straighter than I expected and thanked me in a voice I almost did not hear. David came in a moment later with the leash in one hand and the stroller bumping his hip. He saw the water and the pedals and the way my mother clutched the edge of the table to steady herself. He asked what had happened. Emily answered before anyone else could. She said that my mother had lurched toward the baby with wet hands. She said that she had blocked her to keep the bottle from falling. She said that the vase had been in the wrong place and that she had tried to move it. She said that my mother had slipped because the floor was already wet. She said that we should all be more careful. The room tilted in a way I recognized from other mornings that had not gone this far. I looked at my brother. He had that look he gets when he is trying to stand in two places at once. He said that new parents can be protective. He said that everyone was tired. He said that the baby needed rest. My mother opened her mouth and then closed it again. She turned toward the kitchen. I could see the streak of water down her sweater and the line her body made a straight line from the top of her head to the soles of her shoes. I told David that Mom had not been reaching for the baby. I told him that she had been lifting the vase so she could take it back to the kitchen. He said that none of this mattered if the baby was upset. Emily shifted the baby and began to pat his back. She suggested that going forward my mother stay upstairs when the baby is in the main rooms. She said this softly and with a sweetness that did not reach her eyes. She said that we all wanted what was best for the child. She looked at me as if daring me to name what had just happened. I felt a heat climb into my face. The anger was there, but under it was something colder. It was the understanding that this moment was not sudden at all. It was the crest of a slow rise. It was the sum of small concessions, the chair turned away from the light, the quilt draped as if it had always been there, the way my mother had stopped singing while she cooked. I thought of the bills I had seen on the counter the week before with names that were not my parents' names. I thought of the bedroom upstairs that used to be theirs, and the unfamiliar shape their bed made in the smaller room now. My father said that everyone should eat before things got colder. He reached for the newspaper as if it could protect him. He told Emily that the flowers could stay if the water was wiped up. Emily smiled at him, the way she smiles when he confirms her story without realizing it. She said that for now it would be better if there were fewer triggers in the living room. She said that the baby needed consistency. She said that she would take care of it. I took a towel from the hall closet and pressed it into the wet rug. Water beaded on the cotton and darkened the pattern in spreading circles. My mother stood beside me and placed the vase back on the table. She gathered the fallen petals in her palm as if they were parts of something she could reassemble. She said that she was fine. She said that her knees would be fine. She said that she should have known better than to carry water near the baby. That sentence landed in me like a stone. I wanted to say that she was not the one who needed to know better. I wanted to say that the baby was a child, not a king. I wanted to say that respect had a place in this house that did not depend on whose arms were strongest. The words did not come. They would have been a spark in a dry room. Emily announced that she was taking the baby upstairs because the living room had become overstimulating. David nodded. He told her he would bring up the bottle. As they moved toward the stairs, my mother lifted the towel and folded it neatly as if order could still be made out of this morning. My father retreated to the kitchen and set 2 plates at the table. He asked my mother if she wanted her coffee warmed. She said that it was fine the way it was. I carried the vase back to the counter and emptied what was left into the sink. The petals slid around the drain and clung to the metal rim before disappearing. I rinsed the glass until there was no trace of the roses at all. I set it upside down on the drying rack and listened to the slow drip of water onto the rubber mat. Mom stood beside me with her hands folded. She stared at the window above the sink, where the maple branches pressed their winter outlines against a bleached sky. She said that the baby is beautiful. She said that sleep comes and goes. She said that new mothers can be afraid of everything at once. I said that being afraid does not give a person the right to strike someone else. She did not argue. She said that she would change her sweater and that breakfast would be ready in a minute. She touched my wrist and thanked me for helping. Her fingers were cool and gentle. She walked down the hall toward the small bedroom at the back of the house and closed the door softly behind her. In the quiet that remained, I felt the shape of a decision forming. It was not loud and it was not dramatic. It was a line drawn where none had been drawn before. I looked at the towel folded on the counter and at the empty vase and at the place on the rug where the water had darkened the fibers and then begun to fade. I told myself that the next time anyone tried to name this as an accident, I would say what it was. I told myself that the next time anyone suggested that my mother remove herself from her own living room, I would not let the sentence finish. I told myself that something had ended at the edge of that coffee table when the vase spun and fell. I poured fresh coffee for my father and handed it to him. He thanked me with a distracted half-smile. He asked if I would pass the jam. I did. He read the same paragraph twice and pretended not to notice. The stairs creaked with the weight of the stroller being carried to the landing. A door closed upstairs. The house became the quiet kind of house again, the kind of quiet that hums like a held breath. I breathed in and out and waited for the coffee to cool. I let the morning settle against my skin, like a coat I did not want but would have to wear. I thought of the years behind us and the years ahead. Then I said in my head the only sentence that made sense. This has to stop. Chapter 2. 8 years of being overtaken. I woke with the taste of resolve still in my mouth and let it carry me backward to the year everything started to tilt. It was early spring of 2015 when David pulled into the driveway with a rental truck that looked too big for our modest street. Emily stepped out in new sneakers and a careful smile, her hair pulled tight, as if a loose strand might unravel the next 8 years. They were both apologetic and grateful, and a little frightened, and none of us knew which of those feelings would be left standing by the time winter came again. At first it felt like goodness in motion. Richard walked them through the house with the pride of a man who had painted every baseboard himself. He talked about family helping family, about how jobs come and go, about how mortgages are steady if you respect them. Linda made a casserole and sent me to the store for extra milk, as if milk could make a body feel steadier. We told ourselves this was a season. We told ourselves that people find their footing and then they move forward. We told ourselves that kindness has an end date. The first week was a parade of boxes, the garage filled with plastic tubs and the smell of fresh tape. My office in the back corner became a staging area, then a closet, then something with a crib leaning against the wall like a promise. Emily wanted the master bedroom on the first floor because stairs were hard after long days, and because she was planning for a baby even then, though she did not say it directly. Richard said it made sense, said his knees were fine with the stairs, said he and Linda could take the smaller room upstairs until things settled. He said this with the confidence of a man who has always chosen the generous option and been praised for it. The bedroom change felt like pushing furniture around on a ship you believed would never sink. Linda folded sheets and carried lamps and set their wedding quilt at the foot of a smaller bed, as if shrinking a space could not possibly shrink a person. Emily asked for different curtains for the master, something that looked cleaner. She asked for the dresser to be swapped so the top drawer would not stick. She asked for the mirror to be moved to catch better light. Each request was small, and together they began to sketch a new outline for a house that used to be ours. The kitchen followed. Emily unpacked clear bins and a label maker and a set of knives sharp enough to announce themselves. She organized the pantry by categories that made sense to her. She created a shelf for spices she approved of and a shelf for things she said should be used sparingly. She researched meal plans and set a calendar and told Linda that certain oils were better and certain recipes were too heavy. Linda nodded and listened and handed over the drawer where she kept the wooden spoons she had used for 4 decades. She started humming less in the kitchen and more in the laundry room, where the sound had fewer witnesses. Richard said we were lucky to have someone so organized in the house. He said we might learn a thing or two. He meant it kindly, but his silence did more work than any words could have. Silence can be a road a person takes when all the other roads require courage. He believed family helps family. He believed patience is a kind of pasture that grows back on its own. He did not notice the fence posts being moved a little each week until one day the pasture belonged to someone else. The living room changed next. The armchair that faced the maple tree was turned toward the television for better sightlines. The quilt from the guest room appeared on the couch as if it had been born there. A new lamp arrived in a box and claimed the corner where Linda kept her sewing basket. Emily explained that the room flowed better this way. She explained that clutter increases stress. She explained that aesthetics matter for mood. Linda smiled and said she was learning so much. We told ourselves all of this was temporary. We told ourselves that kindness bends without breaking. We told ourselves that the house would remember us when it was time. Time has a way of teaching the lessons you do not want. David's job prospects flickered and went dark. Emily said she was preparing for motherhood and preparing as a full-time job. They stayed. Seasons turned. The first winter in that new arrangement felt like a test we were passing. The second felt like a test that kept changing the questions. By the third, I had set my coffee cup in the exact same spot on the counter every morning so that one small thing would feel familiar. There were small scenes that would not have meant anything if they had happened once. Emily asking Linda not to use the heavy stockpot because it scratched the stove. Emily moving Richard's woodworking magazines to a box so the end table could look cleaner. Emily saying that the vacuum needed to be run in a specific pattern to protect the carpet fibers. Each correction was a drop of water on the same stone. You start by telling yourself it is just water. I kept visiting on weekends and calling on weeknights. I watched my mother become careful. She asked before she poured a glass of juice on the living room coasters she had bought. She asked before she baked bread because the smell lingered and could be overstimulating. She asked where she should sit for movie night. She did not used to ask permission to breathe. The first real tremor came in a white envelope that looked like all the others. I was gathering the mail because the box slot sticks if you let it get too full. There was the electric bill, the gas bill, the internet service statement. I set them on the counter and noticed that the names on the top line had shifted. Electric service to E. Hartman, gas service to Emily Hartman, internet primary contact Emily H. I felt a small coldness in my throat the way you feel when you misstep on a stair and realize you are not where you thought you were. I handed the stack to Richard and said he had mail. He glanced down and said something about online billing and how sometimes companies make things easier for young people. He said Emily had been on the phone with customer service for a long time last week to fix a rate plan. He said we should be grateful she likes to handle logistics. I told him the bill used to have his name printed in full. He said names on envelopes change all the time. He said not to read into it. That night, I could not stop reading into it. I lay in my apartment and pictured the line on the bill where the name used to be, the way an empty field holds the shape of a fence after it has been pulled up. I told myself there must be a simple reason. I told myself there was no scheme. I told myself a lot of things I wanted to believe more than I wanted sleep. Weeks later, I saw Emily at the kitchen counter with a phone tucked under her chin. Her voice was sweet and efficient, at the same time the voice a person uses when she has practiced getting her way. She spelled her last name slowly and repeated the address and confirmed an account number. She laughed softly and said that yes, she was the primary person to contact. She thanked the representative for correcting the profile. She hung up and slid the papers into a folder embossed with her initials. Linda wiped the counter next to her and asked if she should put the folder in the dining room drawer. Emily said she would file it. I asked Richard if he had set up the new internet account or if Emily had. He said he did not remember that Emily handles the calls because she has time and patience for hold music. I asked where the old paper bills were kept. He said we were trying to go paperless. He said paperless keeps life clean. He said life had gotten messy enough without extra envelopes. My mother's voice thinned during that season. She had always been the kind of woman who could talk about birds and books and the joke the cashier told at the grocery store. Now her sentences were shorter. She waited to be asked. She carried her tea upstairs to the smaller bedroom more often, claiming she liked the view of bare trees in winter. The truth was that the living room no longer belonged to her voice. When spring came again, I found a postcard wedged crookedly into the mail slot. It was from the power company, and it congratulated the household on a successful account update. The wording was cheerful in a way that felt like a dare. I set the card on the kitchen table and watched the light shift across it for a long time. Emily picked it up on her way to the pantry and tucked it into the same embossed folder. Linda asked if she needed a stamp for anything. Emily said she had it covered. I started counting the changes so I would not forget them. The master bedroom had Emily's lotion bottles lined in even rows on the dresser that used to hold my mother's hairpins. The linen closet had been rearranged so that the oldest towels were stored in bins in the garage and the new towels were stacked where guests could see them. The pantry had labels that said grains and proteins and treat shelf, and Linda joked that the treat shelf was above her pay grade. She laughed when she said it. She stopped laughing right after. Richard kept insisting that it was temporary. He said the economy would pick up. He said opportunities would come. He said it was not a big deal that the car insurance for David's car was on our policy because it was cheaper that way. He said that utilities are utilities, and names on files do not change deeds. He said there was no harm in letting someone enthusiastic bring a little order to an older system. The first clear sign arrived not with a crash, but with a click. Linda reached for the thermostat one afternoon and frowned. It would not respond to her touch. Emily drifted in from the hallway with a smile, and a code tapped the screen and the numbers shifted. She said she had installed a smart thermostat so we could save money and track usage. She said she had set permission levels so settings would not get changed by accident. Linda nodded and said that sounded smart. After Emily left, she looked at me with a question she did not voice. I pressed my palm to the glass and felt the house take instructions from someone else. I went home that night with a small square of certainty lodged under my ribs. A name on a bill could be carelessness, a folder could be efficiency, a thermostat that only responded to a code felt like something else. I stood in my kitchen and felt the dull hum of my own refrigerator and thought about lines people draw without telling you they are drawing them. Then I wrote the date down in a notebook and underlined it once the way you mark a page you know you will have to return to. Chapter 3: Gaslighting and Manipulation. It started with small accusations that sounded like reminders but carried the sting of judgment. I would come by after work and hear Emily telling my mother she had left the stove burner on again. The flame was barely visible on the gas range, and Emily pointed it out with a shake of her head. My mother flushed red and whispered that she thought she had turned it off. Emily made a note in her phone saying she needed to keep track for safety reasons. My father stood by the counter and nodded slowly, as if the words made sense to him. I knew my mother had always double-checked the stove. She had taught me to do the same when I was a child. Another day I arrived to find Emily holding up a sweater that had gone through the dryer on high heat. The wool had shrunk to half its size. She told my mother she should not handle laundry anymore, that her memory was slipping and she had ruined good clothing. My mother apologized and folded the ruined sweater neatly before setting it on top of the washer. She said she must have misread the tag. My father muttered that mistakes happen, but his eyes followed Emily when she sighed dramatically. It became a rhythm. Emily would find a minor slip, inflate it, and lay it at my mother's feet like evidence in a trial. My mother stopped speaking up. She began to write small notes for herself on scraps of paper, reminders to unplug the iron or to put leftovers in the fridge. I saw the notes stacked by the sink and in the pockets of her apron. She was trying to protect herself, but the very act of writing them down looked like confirmation of Emily's story. The worst of it came during a doctor's appointment that summer. I went along because my mother had seemed tired and I wanted to be sure she had company. Dr. Anna Price had been our family physician for years, a woman with warm eyes who always asked about the family garden. My mother described feeling more anxious, more forgetful under stress. She said she sometimes lost track of time when she was folding laundry or cooking. Emily leaned forward in her chair and interrupted, saying that my mother had left the oven on 3 times in 1 week, that she had misplaced the baby's bottle and then insisted she had not touched it, that she had forgotten a dentist appointment entirely. Dr. Price frowned and turned back to my mother with careful words. She asked if there was a history of memory issues in the family. She asked if my mother had trouble managing daily tasks. My mother shook her head and tried to explain that it was stress, that the house felt crowded, that she was adjusting to change. Emily pressed harder. She said she was concerned about cognitive decline, that she wanted it documented for safety. She mentioned her own child's well-being and asked if Dr. Price would make a note. I felt heat rising into my chest, but I sat frozen, watching my mother's dignity unravel. Dr. Price finally wrote a line in the chart: mild memory decline under observation. My mother's shoulders sagged as if the words had been branded on her skin. Emily smiled politely and tucked the discharge papers into her bag before I could even glance at them. On the drive home, Emily repeated the doctor's phrase. She said it softly, as if it were undeniable truth. She told my father at dinner that evening. His fork paused midair. He looked at my mother and asked if she was feeling confused more often. She tried to laugh it off, but her laugh broke in the middle. She said she was fine. He told her it was nothing to be ashamed of, that people slow down. Emily reached across the table and patted his arm, sealing the thought into place. I watched the light go out of my mother's eyes. I had seen her face storms with a quiet strength my entire life. Now she looked like a woman standing in quicksand, while the people closest to her told her she was imagining the ground slipping away. My father. The man who had once sworn to trust her judgment above all now looked at her as if she needed supervision. It was a betrayal she could not name. I confronted him later in the garage while he sorted through tools. I asked him if he really believed Mom was losing her memory. He said he did not know what to believe anymore. He said Emily was around the house all day, that she saw things we did not. He said he was trying to be practical. I told him Emily had reasons to exaggerate. He said I was being unfair. He said Emily was trying to help. He said I was too protective of my mother. I stared at the man who had raised me and felt the distance stretch wider than the length of that garage. The following week, Emily announced that she would take over paying bills to avoid late fees. She claimed Mom had forgotten to mail a check for the water bill and that it had nearly cost them a penalty. She pulled the record from her folder, the same folder where she kept the doctor's note. My mother pressed her lips together and said nothing. Richard told her it was sensible to let Emily handle things if she wanted to. I wanted to shout that none of this was sensible, that we were giving away more than chores. I lay awake that night, replaying every moment. I thought about my mother's notes by the sink, the doctor's cautious handwriting, my father's uncertain voice. I thought about how quickly perception can be rewritten if you repeat the same lie enough times. My grief turned into something sharper. I could not sit by and watch my mother erased. That was the night I promised myself I would start keeping my own records. I would write down what I saw, what I heard, what was true. I would not let Emily's folder be the only version of the story. I knew she was building a case, and I knew my father was falling into her shadow. I resolved to gather enough light to burn that shadow away. The decision steadied me. It felt like grabbing hold of a rope in a storm. I told myself I would find proof before she stripped my mother of all authority. I did not know how yet, but I knew the cost of silence. I had watched it drain the color from my mother's face. I would not let it drain mine. Chapter 4. Discovery in the Basement. Night settled over the house like a cover that had been washed too many times. I waited until Emily took the baby upstairs, and Richard turned on the late sports wrap. Linda stacked plates in the dish rack with the quiet care of someone putting away pieces of herself. I said I would check the water softener in the basement since the faucets had been running a little hard. She nodded, grateful for any task that sounded normal. The bulb at the top of the basement stairs flickered in a tired way. I felt along the rail and took each step with the caution you learn in an old Ohio house where wood remembers every season. The air down there was cool and carried the smell of cardboard and detergent and a faint sourness from the ancient deep freeze that only came alive on holidays. The pull chain for the central light clicked, and the room rose around me in soft yellow. Boxes were stacked in tidy towers along one wall. A folding table held a neat row of plastic bins, each with a label written in the same tidy hand. I told myself I was looking for the filter size taped to the softener tank. I told myself I was not trespassing. The softener sat against the far wall with its barrel of salt pellets half full. Next to it stood a metal filing cabinet that had been in our house since I was 8. The key was still in the lock. I turned it and felt a small, disloyal thrill when the drawer slid open without a hitch. The first file was labeled House Utilities. I slid it out and laid it on the folding table. Inside were 3 months of statements from the electric company. I did not need a magnifying glass to see the name at the top, Service to Emily Hartman. The account number matched the number on old invoices with Richard Lawson at the top. The rate plan had been changed to a tiered plan. The contact phone number was one I did not recognize. I set the papers in a neat stack and opened the gas file. The same thing. New primary, same account history. The internet provider was no different. I felt the familiar cold rise into my throat. It had taken all the patience in my body not to accuse before I knew. Now I knew. There was a binder labeled Mail. Inside it was a collection of confirmation cards and postal notices. In the front pocket was a carbon copy of a form authorizing mail forwarding for selected pieces addressed to E. Hartman at our address. The request date was from early spring. The forwarding destination was a box at a private mailbox store on Cleveland Avenue. I traced the box number with my finger and felt the tremor in my hand. This was not administrative help. This was a new address being built out of ours, one paper at a time. I moved slowly to the second drawer of the cabinet. The label said Property. My hand hovered before I pulled it open. Inside were the familiar closing documents from the year my parents bought the house. I ran my fingers over the embossed pages that had felt so adult to me as a child. At the back of the file lay a thin stack of forms printed from a state website. The top page was a conveyance form. The first lines were filled in with our street name and parcel number. The space for transfer amount had been left blank. The space for signatures was empty. The lines for preparer and return address were not. The return address matched the mailbox number in the other folder. I set my palm flat on the table and steadied myself. The house made small night sounds above me. The water heater ticked as it settled. Somewhere on the first floor, the refrigerator motor came to life. I gathered the bills and the forwarding form and the partially filled conveyance page and climbed the steps with a care that felt like reverence and grief stitched together. Linda was wiping the sink when I reached the kitchen. I set the papers on the table and told her I had found something we needed to see together. Her face changed even before she looked. She dried her hand slowly and took the top sheet. I watched her eyes move and stop and move again. Her breath came quick and caught high in her throat. She set one hand flat on the table to steady herself. "This is not a misunderstanding." I kept my voice low. Her fingers shook against the paper. She traced the mailbox store number as if it might rewrite itself if she touched it gently. She picked up the conveyance form and touched the printed lines that held our address like a dare. For a moment she did not speak. When she did, it was a whisper pulled out by effort. She said that she had known something was wrong, and that she had told herself she was being unkind. She said that kindness had turned into permission without her noticing when it happened. Richard came in from the living room to rinse his coffee cup. He saw the papers and frowned in a way that said he had stepped into a scene mid-sentence. I told him what we had found and laid the utility statements side by side with the mail card and the state form. He leaned over the table and made the small, thoughtful sound he makes for the editorial page. He said that maybe Emily was just organizing things. He said not to blow it out of proportion. He said forms can be printed from any site and that nothing had been filed. He sounded tired and like he wanted dinner to be the same as it had always been. I looked at my mother. Her face had gone pale in a careful way. I saw her press her lips together to keep from speaking something she could not take back. I told my father that organization does not require a mailbox across town, and that forms do not fill themselves with parcel numbers and return addresses. He shook his head and said again that we should not escalate without cause. He said that Emily had been keeping things from falling apart. He asked if the water softener needed a new filter. The words hit me like a door closing. I understood that he was deeper in the fog than he knew. I gathered the papers and slid them into a large manila envelope from the junk drawer. Linda touched my wrist and asked what we should do. I told her we would find out exactly where we stood. I told her we would not touch any more files tonight. I told her we needed to keep the light on our side. Emily came into the kitchen with the baby on her hip and asked if the coffee was still fresh. She glanced at the envelope and smiled with the politeness of a gate agent who has learned how to say no without raising her voice. She said she had reorganized the basement files so it would be easier to find things. She said we should try to put items back where we found them so the system worked. Linda nodded and said she would. My father rinsed his cup and said the sports wrap had gone into extra highlights. I took the envelope to the small room at the back of the house where my mother kept her sewing machine. The room smelled like fabric and dust, and the lavender sachet she tucked into drawers. I sat at the small desk and pulled out my phone. The screen felt like a lifeline and an accusation at once. I searched the number for Diane Moore. Diane had represented one of my coworkers during a rough divorce and had a reputation for a mind like a lit match. I found her firm and pressed call. The answering service picked up, and I left a message that was measured enough to be taken seriously and urgent enough to be returned quickly. I said my name and that I was seeking advice about property and potential fraud affecting my parents. I did not say Emily's name. I did not say mailbox or conveyance. Words have a way of traveling farther than you intend. When I hung up, a small part of my fear loosened. It was still there, but it had the shape of something with edges I could study. Linda stood in the doorway with her hands clasped. She asked if calling a lawyer would make things worse. I said that nothing makes things worse faster than pretending. I told her we would keep this between us until we understood what we held. She nodded and sat on the edge of the daybed and stared at the needle of the sewing machine as if it might start moving on its own. She said her mother used to say that paper is patient. She said she had never understood what that meant until tonight. Richard stepped into the hall and asked if anyone had seen the remote. I said it was on the arm of the chair. He thanked me and hesitated as if he might step into the room and ask a real question. He did not. The television came back on and filled the house with the familiar hum of games played by strangers. I checked my phone 3 times in 5 minutes, then put it face down and breathed. The envelope sat heavy on the desk, a simple container for the shift in our lives. I thought of the little changes that had led here, the thermostat responding to a code, the folder with initials, the labels on the pantry. They looked small in isolation like pebbles on a path. Together they spelled a direction. Emily's steps passed the door on her way back upstairs. The baby let out a sleepy sound that would have undone me on another night. This time it made me hold the envelope closer. I pictured the mailbox store on Cleveland Avenue, the narrow strip of fluorescent light over the counter, the rows of rented boxes with their little brass doors. I imagined a key on a ring in a hand that liked the feeling of ownership more than the practice of family. My phone buzzed and I flinched. It was an automated confirmation from the firm that my message had been received and that a call would follow in the morning. I sent a quiet thank you into the room as if the walls needed to hear it. Linda exhaled slowly and said she would make chamomile tea because sleep would not come quickly. I said I would join her in a minute. I slipped the envelope into the bottom drawer of the desk and laid a stack of fat quilting magazines over it. Not hiding, I told myself, protecting. I turned off the small lamp and we walked back down the hall together. The house had returned to its nighttime rhythm. The light over the sink made a soft circle on the counter. The faucet dripped once, then twice, then stopped. My father laughed at something on the television that none of us would remember. Linda set 2 cups on the table and poured hot water over the tea bags. Steam rose and wavered. She touched my hand and told me she was glad I had come by tonight. I told her I was too. We sat for a long moment without speaking, listening to the quiet places between sounds. I felt the line of what came next settling into focus, not sharp yet, but enough. When the kettle clicked as it cooled, I stood and rinsed our cups and set them in the rack. In the morning, there would be a call. For now, the envelope was safe and my mother was beside me and the house was still ours. Chapter 5. The Spark of Resistance. Morning brought the call. I had been waiting for a measured voice from Diane Moore's office inviting us in before lunch. I told Linda, and she folded her hands around her mug as if it might still be warm. We drove downtown along High Street with the envelope on my lap and a string of thoughts that felt like beads I could not stop counting. The air had that Ohio damp that slides under your coat even when the sky looks harmless. Diane's office sat on the second floor of a brick building that had seen a century of people asking for help. The reception area smelled like coffee and toner. Diane greeted us with a firm calm, a person who had stood in a lot of storms without getting blown sideways. She invited us to sit at a wide table, opened a legal pad, and asked me to lay out what we had. I slid the utility bills across, then the postal card, then the partially filled conveyance form. Her eyes moved quickly, pausing in a way that told me she was matching each detail to a map in her head. She said that what we were seeing was a paper trail designed to do 2 things at once. The first was to establish Emily as the primary occupant in the eyes of companies and agencies that sometimes stand in for common sense. The second was to undermine Linda's credibility so that if a dispute arose, Linda would look like a person who needed decisions made for her. Diane tapped the phrase mild memory decline and said it was the kind of line that can be used as leverage if it is repeated often enough. She said tenant rights are real, but they do not create ownership. She said people try to open a door with that phrase and then push through with something heavier. She pointed to the conveyance form and said that someone had already been practicing their handwriting on the other side of that door. I asked her how far this could go. She said that if Emily could compile enough indicators that she was the manager of the home and enough whispers that Linda was unsteady, Emily could try to push for more control. She might float a power of attorney request. She might try to convince Richard that it was time to prepare for transitions. She might slip a document under stress and hope for signatures that could be framed as consent. She might even try to record a deed if she could find a way to make it look routine. Diane said we were not there yet, but the line of travel was visible. Linda listened with her hands folded tightly together. She asked if we had done something wrong by letting things slide. Diane said that trust is not a mistake and that the law cares more about what is on paper than the etiquette of kitchens. She turned to me and laid out a plan that felt like someone handing me a map and a compass. We would copy everything and keep originals in place. We would photograph envelopes, labels, thermostat screens, any place where control had been established. We would begin a contemporaneous log with dates and times noting incidents without adjectives. We would request a complete copy of Linda's medical records from Dr. Price and attach a patient note clarifying context. We would go to the post office with Linda's identification and rescind the forwarding authorization that had been set without the property owner's consent. We would not change locks because that would turn a conflict into a crisis. We would not accuse when documentation would do more work than anger. We would consider a written occupancy agreement signed by Richard as owner that clarified that David and Emily lived there by permission and outlined house rules, a document that would pull the ground back under us if the argument shifted into law. Richard arrived late, called in by my text that said we needed him. He walked in with his hands in his coat pockets, the posture of a man who wants to keep his fingers from making commitments. Diane repeated the plan. He asked if all of this was necessary, if talking could fix what had gone bent. He said he worried we were tearing the family apart. Diane did not laugh or scold. She said families tear when boundaries are invisible, not when they are named. She said silence is not peace, it is a draft that chills the rooms where truth should be. He stared at the table and said he would think about the occupancy agreement. Linda whispered that thinking is good, and then she touched his sleeve as if his arm needed reminding where it belonged. We left with a folder of copies and a list that felt like a lifeline. Outside, the wind had picked up and blew the smell of coffee from the cart on the corner against our faces. Linda asked if we had time to sit for a minute. We found a small table in the lobby of the building, and I watched her wrap both hands around a paper cup. She said she should have seen this sooner. I told her that seeing is not the same thing as naming. We were naming things now. Back on our street, the recycling bins were lined up like a little blue parade. Jack Reynolds was rolling his back to his driveway. He lifted a hand when he saw us. Jack had the steady presence of someone who had asked hard questions for a living. He walked over and asked how my mother was holding up. He looked at me with that look older neighbors have when they know more than they have said. I told him we were taking some steps. He nodded, then said there was something I should hear. He said that a few days ago he had been fixing his mailbox when Emily walked past on the phone. He did not mean to hear, but the words carry in that stretch of sidewalk. She told whoever was on the other end that the house would be hers soon, that it was practically done if she stayed patient, that the older folks were soft, and that papers would bend if pressed the right way. Jack said he did not like repeating this kind of talk, but he thought I should know. He offered to put what he heard into an email with the date and the time, and he offered to testify if it came to that. He said he was retired now and his schedule could accommodate the truth. I stood there with the folder under my arm and felt the sensation of not being alone fill my lungs. Richard shifted his weight and said we should not make enemies of the people we share a hallway with. Jack smiled thinly and said that enemies are usually declared by behavior, not by neighbors repeating what was already spoken in public air. He squeezed Linda's shoulder and told her she had friends on this street. Linda's eyes shone, and she thanked him. We watched him walk back across the grass as if he knew the exact path to take when the ground is muddy. Inside, I turned the dining table into an island of order. I set out the phone, the portable scanner, a lined notebook, a pencil sharper than my patience, a stack of clean folders. I placed the manila envelope to one side and opened it like a slow breath. Each document was photographed, scanned, labeled with the date, uploaded to a folder that I shared with my own email so that copies lived in more than one place. I created a document called Household Log and typed the first entries with times and simple descriptions. Linda, standing to my right, initialed the top corner of each scanned page so that the chain of custody had a human mark to meet the digital one. Then came the calls. I asked the clinic for a copy of my mother's chart and a clarification note from Linda about stress and environmental change. I asked the post office what was needed to cancel selective forwarding set up by someone other than the property owner, and I learned that identification and a simple form would be enough when presented in person. I looked up the account settings for the thermostat and photographed the screen that said administrator control assigned to a single user. I did not change the setting, I documented it. Richard hovered at the edge of the room, then sat and folded his hands like a student who does not want to be called on. He said again that he worried about the family. He said that turning this into evidence felt like crossing a line. I told him that the line had been drawn months ago, that we were only tracing it now so we could step back onto our own side. He said he was tired. Linda brought him a glass of water and touched the back of his neck with a tenderness that made my throat ache. Diane's email arrived as the afternoon light thinned. She had drafted a calm letter clarifying the terms of David and Emily's occupancy and setting house rules on mail bills, access to files, and shared spaces. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of document that puts the floor back under your feet and dares anyone to pretend it is still quicksand. Diane suggested that Richard deliver it in person with Linda present and that I record the date and the time and what was said in the log. She suggested that I pick up a small notebook that could live in the kitchen drawer, ready for anyone to add an entry when a line was crossed. I printed the draft and placed it inside a new blue folder. I wrote a small list on an index card and slid it into the notebook a guide so that anyone could write an entry the same way. Date, time, location, what happened, who was present, any documents or messages involved. No adjectives, no forecasts, just the facts standing on their own legs. A soft knock sounded at the back door and Jack's email arrived at the same moment on my phone. He had written the day and the hour and the words he heard. He had signed with his full name and a line about his years on the force. He said he could come by if we needed him. I felt the room settle a little the way a boat does when it finds the calm in a rough current. We ate dinner at the small kitchen table with the folders stacked like a second centerpiece. No one spoke much. Richard looked at the blue folder and then at Linda and then at his plate. He said that we could give the letter tomorrow evening when David came home from work. He said that he would read it again before he spoke. Linda nodded and reached for his hand. He let her hold it, and in that small gesture the house felt like itself for a heartbeat. After dishes, I cleaned the table and left only the notebook and a pen in the corner. The lamplight turned the paper a warm cream. I flipped to the first page and began with the date and the hour and the simplest line I could write. Then I set down the pen, closed the cover, and listened to the quiet of the rooms that were still ours for now. Chapter 6. The family council erupts. Aunt Sarah arrived on a gray Saturday evening with her casserole dish wrapped in foil and her mouth already set in a line that meant she had something to say. She was 58, sharp-eyed, and had inherited the Lawson stubbornness in equal measure to my father. She hugged my mother tightly, kissed my cheek, and gave Richard a look that carried more history than words could. Emily stood at the counter with her phone, half smiling, half checking messages, while David poured iced tea into tall glasses, as if nothing in the world could be unsettled. We sat down to dinner with the air stretched tight across the table. Sarah asked about the garden and my mother's roses. Emily answered before Linda could, saying the bushes had been trimmed too late last season, and that she had adjusted the schedule to avoid another mistake. My mother lowered her eyes to her plate. Sarah noticed, and her fork paused mid-air. She turned to Emily and asked about the paperwork she had been signing in the Lawson name. The room stilled. Richard coughed and reached for the breadbasket. Emily lifted her chin and asked what paperwork Sarah meant. Sarah did not blink. She said she had heard about bills being changed, about mail being redirected, about documents sitting in folders that did not belong to Emily. She asked what gave her the right. Emily set her fork down slowly, as if composing herself. She said she had been running this household for nearly 8 years. She said she paid attention to details no one else bothered with. She said she cooked, cleaned, organized, scheduled, and cared for a newborn under this roof, while others looked the other way. She said that her effort counted as much as anyone's deed. I felt the sting in my chest at the words. My mother's hand trembled against her glass. Richard cleared his throat and said Emily had a point. He said effort counts too. He said families are built on contribution, not just names on paper. Linda stared at him as if he had spoken in another language. I could not hold back. I leaned forward and asked David directly whose side he was on. I asked if he stood with his wife or with the parents who had sheltered him when work ran dry, who had offered their bed and taken the stairs for his comfort, who had carried the weight of silence while the walls of their own home shifted around them. The words came hot, and for a moment I saw my brother as a boy again, caught between two paths. David set his glass down with too much care. He said it was not about sides, that we were all family, that arguing would not solve anything. His voice shook at the edges. Emily touched his arm and told him softly that she had his back, that he did not need to answer. Sarah leaned in and said he had already answered by staying quiet. The silence that followed was thick and alive, filling every corner of the dining room. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. The casserole cooled. Richard rubbed his forehead as if a headache had begun. Emily stared straight ahead, her jaw tight. My mother's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. I wanted to reach across and lift the weight off her, but the moment had already sealed itself. What had been whispered and hidden was now standing in the open. There was no pretending anymore, no papering over with polite phrases or tired jokes. We were at the edge of something that could not be walked back. Richard finally pushed his chair back and stood. He said it was late and that everyone was tired. He said the conversation could wait for another time. Sarah shook her head but gathered her plate. Emily rose with the baby monitor in her hand and excused herself. David followed her silently, shoulders hunched. I stayed seated, my palms flat against the table, feeling the heat of my own anger pulse through me. My mother sat across from me, her face pale but her spine straight. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder before she left, promising she was not going anywhere. When the front door closed behind her, the house felt hollow and charged all at once. Richard stood by the sink, staring out the window as if the dark yard held answers. Linda carried dishes to the counter without a word. I gathered the remaining plates and stacked them carefully, telling myself that the war lines had finally been drawn, that the quiet of the rooms would never sound the same again. Chapter 7. Collapse and Justice. Morning carried a weight that made the walls feel closer. I brewed coffee that tasted like worry and waited for the call from Diane. It came just after 9. She said that the notice was signed, printed, and sent by courier and by email, and that the language was plain enough for anyone to understand. She reminded me to keep everything calm, to point to paper and not to people. I thanked her and stood at the kitchen window watching the maple branches trace the same sky my parents had looked at for decades. The rooms held history, but today they held something else too. They held a boundary. By noon, the courier envelope lay on our table with its serious weight. Richard read the letter twice. He pressed his thumb to the edge of the page as if to test its strength. Linda dried the same cup again and set it down gently. The language was simple. David and Emily lived here by permission. Mail for the owners must not be intercepted. Utilities would be returned to the owners of record. Files in the house were private. Shared spaces would be used by house rules. Decisions about the property belonged to Richard and Linda. It was an instruction on how to be a family that had forgotten its shape. Emily appeared in the doorway holding the baby monitor like a badge. She asked what we were whispering about. I told her there was a letter clearing up some confusion. She took it without waiting. Her eyes moved quickly and then faster. She said she would take the baby and leave by nightfall. She said the house was unsafe. She said we had turned on her. David told her to slow down. She lifted her palm as if to stop his words from landing. I told her it was not an eviction. I told her it was a clarification. She said families do not need lawyers. She said families do not gather proof. She said families do not treat dinner tables like courtrooms. My father said quietly that families also do not open mailboxes across town with someone else's address. Emily stared at him, that flat stare that feels like cold water on the back of your neck. I set the folder on the table and opened it so the documents spoke for themselves. I placed the utility statements with her name on the top line. I placed the mail forwarding card with the box number on Cleveland Avenue. I placed the partially filled transfer form that carried our parcel number like a dare. I placed a photograph of the thermostat screen that named a single administrator. I laid out the log with dates and events written in even letters. I said that Jack had written a note about what he heard, and that Aunt Sarah had recorded her memory of the dinner. I said that Dr. Anna Price had provided a copy of the visit notes and that a patient clarification had been added by request. Richard looked at each item as if time itself had left fingerprints. He asked Emily if she had set up the mailbox. She said that mail gets lost and that she had been protecting important things. He asked if she had filled out the top of the transfer form. She said that forms drift in old files and that anyone could have printed it. He asked if she had changed the names on the utility accounts. She said that someone had to manage a house. He asked if she had told anyone that the house would soon be hers. She said people say things when they are under pressure. Linda took a breath that sounded like paper tearing. She said that she had kept a home without folders and passwords for 40 years. She said that she had never needed a code to turn on her own heat. She said that she had trusted her family. She put her hand flat on the table as if she needed to feel something that did not move. Emily turned to David. She said we were trying to break them. She said he owed loyalty to the family he made, not the one he came from. She said my father would never respect him unless he took charge. She said I had always resented him for being first. She told him to pack a bag. David stared at the hallway as if there were two doors and each one led to a different version of himself. Richard spoke in a voice I barely recognized. He said he had tried to be fair. He said he had looked away from small things, because small things felt like the cost of living under one roof. He said he had believed Emily about Linda's memory, because belief was easier than standing up in his own home and saying no. He turned to my mother and said he was sorry. Her eyes filled, and the apology sat between them like a bridge that would take time to cross. The storm gathered and broke. Emily said that effort made her a stakeholder. She said the deed meant less than daily labor. She said she had earned the right to decide. Richard said a deed is not a suggestion. He said ownership is not a feeling. He said the law is not a decoration you hang when it suits you. Emily said he was ungrateful that he had no idea how much work she had done. She said Linda could not be trusted with basic tasks. Linda flinched and then lifted her chin. I held to Diane's advice and let the facts keep marching. The log showed the day the thermostat code was set. The email printout showed the address change for the gas bill. The receipt showed the mailbox rental paid in advance. The photo showed the folder with initials where house files had been taken. I read dates. I did not raise my voice. The room still filled with noise. Then the admission came clean. Emily said that yes, she had begun a process to secure the property. She said somebody had to think about the future. She said decisions would need to be made by a person who could make them. She said David was not built for the hard part of life that she was, and that this was for everyone's good. The words landed with an awful clarity. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Richard sat down hard as if a string had been cut. He looked at the far wall and did not focus. Linda wept in that quiet way that makes you want to catch the tears with your hands. I felt a ringing in my ears and my vision narrowed to the papers on the table and the edge of my mother's sleeve. The game had been named aloud. The air felt different after that. David moved as if he were walking out of a fog. He asked Emily whether she had planned to tell him. She said she had planned to show him a solution. He asked whether she had lied about the accounts. She said she had streamlined. He asked whether she had used their child to force decisions. She did not answer. The silence sat on the table like another page in the folder. He picked up the notice from Diane and read it all the way through, lips moving on certain lines. He picked up the transfer form and held it by the corner, careful not to touch the signature field. He looked at our parents, and then at me, and then at Emily. His shoulders dropped. He said he would file for divorce in the morning. He said he would seek full custody of Ethan because a child is not a lever. He said he was done living inside a threat. Emily laughed short and sharp. She said he would never take her baby. She said no judge would believe him over a mother. She said the house was poisoned against her. She reached for the monitor. Richard did not raise his voice. He said the baby would sleep. He said we were not done. He said the truth had to be finished out loud. I gathered the documents and slid them back into the folder. My hands were not steady, and I let them be unsteady. Linda wiped her face with the corner of a dish towel and folded it as if neatness could hold her together. David stared at the table with the expression of a man seeing the floor for the first time after months of a moving deck. Emily stood very still. The energy that had driven every correction and every instruction seemed to drain, leaving a brittle shell. She started listing what she had done. She said she had cooked and organized and scheduled and made lists. She said she had bought light bulbs and fixed passwords and negotiated rates. She said she had earned more than gratitude. Richard listened and then said that gratitude has a place, and so does law. He said she had crossed both. Something in Emily gave way. Her shoulders shook and she slid into the chair as if her legs forgot their work. She pressed her palms to her eyes. She said she was tired. She said no one understood. She said she had been the only adult in a house of children. The words no longer carried power. They carried exhaustion. The room felt different. The reverse had happened silently. Control had slipped from her hands and she could feel it. Richard looked at me and then at Linda. He said he should have listened sooner. He said his silence had been a kind of permission and that he was done with it. He said he would call Diane himself. Linda put her hand over his. The old promise of us seemed to flicker in that simple touch. The furnace kicked on and warm air rolled from the vent. Outside, a delivery truck idled and moved on. I wrote the time in the log and one bare sentence that the notice was delivered and the admission made and the decision declared. I closed the notebook and set it beside the folder. The house felt as if it had settled a fraction of an inch back onto its foundation. No one spoke for a long moment. Emily kept her hands over her face. David stood at the sink and gripped the edge until the knuckles whitened. Richard stared at the maple shape printed across the window by streetlight. Linda breathed in and breathed out. The night had the strange quiet of rooms that have heard too much. We sat inside it and waited for what morning would require. Chapter 8. Karma and Resolution. Morning arrived with a pale light that made every surface of the house look sharper than usual. Diane called before 9 to confirm that the court filing was accepted and that a hearing would be set within days. She told me to gather the originals and prepare for testimony, but that the evidence already painted a clear picture. I hung up and watched my parents move around the kitchen in silence. Richard pouring coffee, Linda slicing toast with the care of someone trying not to shake. David sat stiffly at the table, his eyes hollow from a night without sleep. Emily did not come downstairs. The Franklin County Courthouse smelled of paper and polish. We sat in the wooden benches with Diane at our side, her presence steady and firm. Emily entered with her lawyer, her expression brittle, her hair tied back in a way that made her look smaller than she wanted. She avoided our eyes, but clutched a file thick with arguments that would not stand. David sat apart from her, a distance that said more than any words. The judge read the charges slowly. Document fraud, mail fraud, attempted transfer without consent. The words landed like stones in water, sinking into the record. Diane presented our folder page by page. Utility bills, mail forwarding authorization, the unsigned conveyance form, Jack Reynolds's written testimony neat and precise. Aunt Sarah's account of the dinner where Emily had dropped the mask. Dr. Price's clarification that stress and household conflict, not dementia, had explained Linda's tiredness. Emily's lawyer tried to frame it as confusion, as overzealous organization, as a woman stretched thin by motherhood. But the judge was not moved. The pattern was too clear. The intent was written in ink and dates. When the ruling came, it felt like the air itself shifted. Emily was convicted of document fraud and mail fraud. She received 2 years probation. She lost custody of Ethan. Her visits would be supervised. The gavel struck, and the sound echoed in my chest like a door finally closing. David exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for months. My mother reached for his hand. Richard bowed his head, and when he lifted it again, I saw both shame and relief. Emily sat motionless for a moment, then broke down in a way I had never seen, sobbing into her hands as her lawyer patted her shoulder. It was not triumph I felt. It was the weight of truth settling where it belonged. Weeks passed. David moved into a small rented apartment near North Linden, nothing fancy, but his name was on the lease and the bills. He paid them on time. He started showing up at our house with Ethan on weekends, sometimes with takeout, sometimes with nothing but his son and an awkward smile. Little by little, the air between him and my parents softened. Richard fixed his faucet. Linda stocked his freezer with casseroles. Trust was not rebuilt in a day, but the steps were visible. Linda rediscovered herself in the garden behind the house. I would come by and find her knees in the dirt, her hands stained with soil, but her face lit with something steady. She planted tomatoes, trimmed the roses, coaxed color back into the beds that had been left bare. Ethan toddled after her with a plastic watering can, spilling more than he poured. She laughed with him in a way I had not heard in years. Sometimes Richard joined reading on the porch, but looking up often as if memorizing the sound of his wife and grandson in harmony. Emily's path went the other direction. Word of the conviction spread quickly through the neighborhood. The lease applications she filed were rejected once the background check returned. She found a cramped apartment off East Hudson Street, walls thin carpet stained. Neighbors kept their distance. The mailbox rows carried whispers. She walked the hallways with her head down. Visits with Ethan took place at the county center, supervised by staff who made notes on clipboards. She arrived with carefully packed snacks and toys, but the boy often clung to David when it was time to leave. The pride that had fueled her once was gone, replaced by isolation. I visited her once, not out of obligation, but curiosity. She looked smaller, the lines around her eyes deeper. She asked if my parents spoke of her. I told her the truth. They spoke of Ethan. She nodded and looked away. There was nothing else to say. I left with the feeling that karma had done its work, not loudly, but with the quiet persistence of gravity. On a warm evening that summer, my family gathered on the back porch. The grill smoked. Ethan laughed with sticky hands, and Linda set a vase of zinnias on the table. Richard raised his glass and said we had lost too many years to silence. He said he was grateful for the noise of family filling the house again. My mother squeezed his hand and smiled. David looked at me with gratitude that needed no words. I sat back and let the moment settle. We had endured 8 years of manipulation of paper trails and whispered doubts of walls that felt less like shelter and more like cages. Yet it had only taken one act of courage to change the course, a single refusal to stay silent, a decision to call a lawyer, a step into the storm. We had reclaimed justice not just for the house, but for respect itself. Respect must be defended even within the walls that are supposed to keep you safe. As I looked around at my family, I thought of the lesson carved into every page of this fight. Justice does not arrive on its own. It begins the moment you dare to say the words that draw the line. This stops now. And if you have ever felt the weight of silence pressing on your own home, I hope you find the courage to say it too. Tell me in the comments if you believe in that moment of courage and stay with me here for more stories where the truth finally wins. 10 years of lies ended in court. The shocking fall of a greedy daughter-in-law. Thamnai Emily. Your wet hands should never reach toward the baby. This is not a safe environment for a newborn. Mota. For 8 years, a greedy daughter-in-law twisted love into lies, nearly stealing the family home. What began as silence turned into betrayal, manipulation, and humiliation until one act of courage changed everything. From secret documents to courtroom revelations, this family drama is a shocking tale of revenge, betrayal, and karma that will leave you breathless, based on true-style stories from Reddit's Revenge Chronicles.